Oh, hello. Pardon me. It looks like we're live. So, welcome to the Sunday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about branding. Today I want to talk about what is probably the most famous soundtrack of all time, the soundtrack to Star Wars, composed and conducted by John Williams. And its fame and its omnipresence in the world of music, of soundtracks, of comedy. It's used to underscore various things, think Family Guy types of parodies. It really sort of betrays the fact that when the first Star Wars, I know it's the fourth, please don't, we all know. When Star Wars came out in 1977, the soundtrack was both conceived and perceived in a very different way than it is now. And the reason for this is that the 70s was a very much revolutionary period in the history of soundtracks. The nature of Hollywood soundtracks was changing. Now, to understand what came before the sort of late 60s and 70s, you have to look at the big studio epics from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, biblical tales of Ben Hur, or people making a bridge on the River Kwai, or people that were films that were just filmed versions of hits that were already shows on Broadway and the West End, things like The Sound of Music, West Side Story, that type of thing. But when it comes to your big epics, think Spartacus, think the great Miklos Rocha soundtrack to Ben Hur, one of the best of all time. There were people that were quite innovative. I mean, even though Maurice Jarre only discovered or only used electronic synthesizer scores later in his career, there was very a lot of harmonics that were used in soundtracks like Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, and Ryan's Daughter that were somewhat modern given the standards of the day of the epic scores. But by the late 60s, this was changing. And the idea that you hired a composer to make a big, epic, traditional sounding, sort of neoclassical type of score, it was still common. It still is in a way, but it was becoming less fashionable by the late 60s. And what was taking its place? The use of pre existing music, both classical and from the pop and rock and soul worlds. And in 68 and 69, there were two soundtracks that really sort of planted this flag in the sand. One from 69 was Easy Rider, because this was the first huge film. It wasn't the first, but it was the first huge film with a big budget behind it, comparatively, to use prominent contemporary rock songs on its soundtrack. Notably, there was a lot of Steppenwolf on the soundtrack. More notably, was the song Born to Be Wild, but it was a soundtrack of the era, and it was about men of the era living a modern Wild West lifestyle on their motorcycles. The year before, though, something equally important happened. Stanley Kubrick had initially hired a film composer to compose a soundtrack to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and this version has circulated online, and it's your traditional sort of light classical, neoclassical, neo-romantic 50s, 60s style Hollywood soundtrack. Very good, actually, very good composition, but Kubrick's thought, no, I want to use pre-existing well-known music, and he did, including most famously Richard Strauss's also Sprach Zarathustra, Johann Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz, the Adagio from Khachaturian's Gain. There's quite a lot of the modern Hungarian composer Ligeti in there, and so all of that put the film on the map, as did its wonderful 70 millimeter cinematography. And this opened the floodgates to a 1970s era where soundtracks became much more contemporary, much cooler. I mean, think of things like Harold and Maude using Cat Stevens. Think of Stanley Kubrick again using Wendy Carlos, the great Moog synthesizer player, to recreate, reimagine, if you will, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in A Clockwork Orange. Think of all of the great so-called blaxploitation films. There was Shaft, Sir Isaac Hayes, wonderful powerful stuff there. The great Curtis Mayfield with Superfly, so many great sort of funk and soul soundtracks in that genre. And just in general, you had a lot of music that was very much stripped down, very much contemporary. The Leroy Anderson stuff, which shows that there was less of a gap between the sort of non-American or independent American films and the Hollywood productions. Hollywood in the 70s, it went indie in terms of its vibe. It went downtown, as you know, as opposed to uptown. Girl. Oh, Billy Joel feels better, by the way. And so that was the 70s. I mean, and even looking at the late 70s, Saturday Night Fever, that was music. I mean, okay, you can maybe say, okay, it was about disco. So what are you going to do? Have a neo Bach type of soundtrack? But nevertheless, it was all about music of the day. Grease was all about rock and roll, huge selling soundtrack from the late 70s. And so throughout the decade, Rocky, very much a modernistic composition. You know it when you hear it. That was a huge soundtrack. Even some Rocky Horror Picture Show taking sort of Broadway into the counterculture, if you will. Even Jaws by John Williams was very much minimalistic compared to the things he would do later on. And then Star Wars happened. Now, Star Wars, in many ways, is the in terms of its cinematographic history, was sort of this interesting paradox between the new and old. You think of space and you think of people using spacecraft and you think of the future, but no, Star Wars took place in the past. Well, how could that be? Oh, because it was in a galaxy far, far away that was more technologically advanced. Oh, okay, story checks out. So that already sets the stage for the paradox. Technologically, they used a lot of very new things to make these spacecraft come to life. The sound effects were done by a lot of the modern synthesizers of the day, but the story itself was very much your classic tale of good and evil, David and Goliath, the kinds of things that you would have seen in some of these biblical 50s and 60s epics, things like Ben-Hur, in the Bible in the beginning, using these traditionalist themes, but putting them in the context of a foreign world, a world where space travel is as common as air flight and avian warfare was in the modern 1970s. Now, what to do for the soundtrack was the question. Now, George Lucas originally wanted to go the same route as Stanley Kubrick did with his sort of hyper realistic space allegory. He wanted to use music that was already known, and he hired John Williams to be a consultant for that. And John Williams said, maybe because he wanted the biggest payday you've ever seen, or maybe just because he knew something that Lucas didn't necessarily know at the time, that this needs an original score. And John Williams composed it. And it was very different than a lot of the stuff going on in the 70s because it was a throwback to a more traditionalist neo-romantic style of music. There was zero pretense of soul, jazz, R&B, rock and roll, anything contemporary. There were no electric guitars in the score. Synthesizers, while used to do the sound effects in the movie, weren't used in the score. It was your traditional large Wagnerian orchestra playing neo-romantic music composed by John Williams, a very versatile composer, but certainly the neo-romantic style is that which he is most associated with. NBC, there you go. This is Tom Brokaw. I could go on all day. But anyway, so that was revolutionary. And this led to a duality in 80s soundtracks. The very sort of cool, hip, original music that coexisted in the 70s alongside people who used pre existing music, that went out. And in the 80s, you had this dualism of the return of neo romantic scores. Think John Williams again with things like Indiana Jones, and also the ultra popified soundtrack in the 80s. Think Flashdance, think An Officer and a Gentleman, Love Lift Us Up Where We Belong, think Fast Times at Ridgemont High, think heavy metal, think I don't know, just about every soundtrack in the 80s. And so the 80s sort of borrowed from the 70s, but also borrowed from the 50s and 60s. And a lot of that was because of how Star Wars changed filmmaking. If the sort of 40s, 50s, and 60s were about epic filmmaking, at least until the late 60s, and then if the late 60s and 70s were about these indie style, dirty, gritty, dark films. The 80s was all about blockbusters, whether they took place in space, whether they took place in a desert, whether they took place in suburban Chicago. No matter where they took place, it was all about adventurous blockbusters that really aimed for a young audience, because Star Wars was really something that became, although lots of people saw it, it was really something that developed a cult like status among young people. So much so that the great actor Sir Allen Guinness, when a boy asked him for his autograph, referring to his character, he said, he wrote a note that was, I think, very heartfelt. He said, "Look, don't get sucked into a world of fiction. It's just a story." And Sir Alec, yes, he was a bit, he wasn't the, he didn't really understand the film anyway, which I think made his performance better. He was someone who, again, was a great Shakespearean thespian who was in so many of my favorite films. Obviously, his greatest role was probably Bridge on the River Kwai, but he did one hell of a job in Lawrence of Arabia as well. But there you go. But when it comes to music, that's what a lot of people forget. Star Wars with John Williams said, no, we're not going to sort of have a clavinet while someone strums a guitar with a wah wah pedal. We're not going to synth out Beethoven. We're not going to have Steppenwolf appear. We're not going to have the Bee Gees perform on the Death Star, or Olivia Newton-John do a dance on the Millennium Falcon. No, we're going to have neo-romantic music with very identifiable melodies and leitmotifs, musical themes. And again, everyone now just takes that for granted, because that sort of set the template for the next sort of 20 years of soundtrack making. Because in the 90s, you still have this duality between sort of neo-romantic soundtracks on the one hand, and soundtracks that were full of the music of the day, the pop hits of the day. And now we're seeing kind of a return to the use of pre-existing music, because now that the film industry has sort of been subsumed into the tech world because of streaming, you see streaming companies that have good relationships with the music, with the music holders, the rights, the master right holders, who are in many cases now big asset management or private equity firms. And so there are now more deals to be made about licensing pre-existing music than there were. It was always possible, but musicians and the owners of the master rights used to be more protected, where now it's really the only way you can make money with the musical recording. Streaming doesn't really pay much. The small and niche physical format market just isn't what it used to be. You say, oh, people are collecting records. Well, yeah, they are, but not enough to change the financial fortunes of the industry. And so you're seeing now the return to licensing pre-existing music. So much like it did in the 70s, what goes around comes around, as rats suck. So anyway, as always, like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.